It's for the sermon, if you want to pull that out. If you need a pen, does anybody need a pen, or does anybody need that sheet? I don't actually even have one on me. I could show it to you. But if you need the note sheet, or if you need a pen, just raise your hand real quick. Looks like everybody's got one. Okay. If you open up, if you look at that, we have at the very top, we're going over our mission, and we have at the very top our vision and our mission statement. And so hopefully, I'm hoping that some of you are getting the hang of this by now. But if you go to that first one, it says our vision is to see people experience what? Wholeness in Jesus. Our vision is to see people experience wholeness in Jesus. We believe that Jesus is the only person that you can find wholeness in, fully and completely, that in Him you will find the fullness of joy and what that means, what life really is and what it means. He's the only one you can find it in. The second thing is our mission. So what do we do? Our vision is what we want to see. Our mission is what we do. And so our mission is to worship God, grow in our relationships, and develop servant hearts. We've already talked about worshiping God. We did 4 weeks on that, and we're on 3 out of 4 weeks on grow in our relationships, and so that's what we're going to be talking about today. If you are curious about where that mission statement came from, just go read Acts chapter 2. This is on your note sheet, Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, and what you'll see there is what the early church looked like right after Jesus ascends to heaven, what they look like. And we drew out of that kind of those 3 things. They worshiped God, they were growing in their relationships, and they had servant hearts, and they were developing servant hearts. Well, we're talking about growing in our relationships. And we talked a couple weeks ago about how we are made, literally made. In the Genesis story, you see it. We're made to know others and to be known ourselves. So we're not made to be islands, to be isolated, to be people who just kind of sit back and say, Netflix is cool, and I love that, and I'm going to stay inside my house all day. But we're also not made to just always tell everybody else about who we are. We're also made to know other people and to then be known ourselves. And then last week, Lois talked about a bunch of really practical ways that we can begin to be better at being family, about being closer together. I hope that some of those things, those practical things she talked about, have been things that you've been able to implement into your own life. This week, we're talking about something that a lot of us probably know, even if we haven't been in church very long in our lives. But before I get to it, I remember when I was a kid, we had these neighbors. We lived in a neighborhood there was like a block, like a little square. And there was a house next to us, and then there was a house that was on the opposite street, and their backyard came up against ours. And I remember that one day, our neighbors got a rooster. And I swear to you, that rooster was broken. It thought the sun rose at 5 a.m. every day. It also thought the sun rose at 5:32 a.m. and 6:04 a.m. and 8:14 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. and 8 p.m. and sometimes 12 p.m. or 12 a.m. You know, this thing, it was broken. The thing thought it needed to crow all the time, and I just remember how how incredibly annoying it was. Right? It was just so frustrating. And you hear this all the time. It's hard to sleep. And I remember one day waking up, I was probably about 8 or 9 at the time, and I remember one day I woke up and I didn't hear the rooster crowing, which I thought was odd. And I was in the dining room eating breakfast. I remember this vividly. I was in the dining room eating breakfast, and I look out the sliding glass door out towards where their house is, and what I saw should have horrified me at 8 years old. And it didn't. But before I get to what I saw, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I could never be a hunter. I could never go hunting. Some of you have done that in your lives. My friend and I, we shot a crow one time because it was eating his mom's cherries, and we felt so bad. Like, I've never wanted to make an animal go through that, so I could never do that. So what I saw that day should have horrified me, because the same neighbors that had a rooster, also had a dog, and they had created a little pen for the rooster, and the dog had the rest of the backyard. And that day, I saw that the dog had forever silenced the rooster. And it was literally at the point where it was like, for graphic detail, it was like it already killed the thing, but was trying to pull it through the fence so it could, So that's what I witnessed. And I should have been horrified, but to this day, that dog is the best neighbor I've ever had. I mean, seriously, that thing was, that rooster was awful. But neighbors are a funny thing because you can have neighbors around you that are really great people, right? That they'll let you borrow stuff. My yard is like 80% weeds and moss at this point, and so I got some stuff from Home Depot, and I needed to take it out and spread it. And so I borrowed my neighbor's spreader thing. I don't even know what they're called. And then so people can be like that. They can invite you over for like 4th of July, that type of thing. They can also be the opposite of all of those things. And maybe some of you who have had neighbors that you either have great or terrible stories to tell, you'd rather not talk about them at all. But that's the funny thing about neighbors, and the interesting thing to me is that you can't control what neighbors you have. You can only control what kind of neighbor you are. And in the Bible, Jesus talks about this, because in the Bible, when we talk about neighboring, I'm making it into a verb today, neighboring, or neighbor, how to neighbor. It's a verb now. When Jesus talks about this, he uses a really specific story. We often think about growing in our relationships, as we're talking about this, we don't think about it in this neighbor term, because it's used in the Bible, but it's not really used in our English language very much. And when we think of neighbor, we think of someone in our close proximity, right? Someone who lives down the street from me or next to me or whatever it is. But it's so cool because one of the coolest things to me is when you invite someone who's not in close proximity to you into close proximity to you. If you ever watched Mr. Rogers, right? Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and at the end he'd say, "Will you be my neighbor?" Right? And what was really cool about that is, and I went back and watched it as I was preparing for this, and I was like, man, I never noticed this as a 5-year-old who was not analyzing this critically. But as I'm watching, I realized like Mr. Rogers he's closing the distance. You could be on the other side of the country from wherever he was filming this stuff, and then when he says, "Will you be my neighbor?" he's inviting you into close proximity to him, not physically, but now you're going to be part of this next half an hour together, right? Where we're friendly and we want to learn together and we get to just be together. That's what he's doing. He's inviting people from far away into close proximity, and so that's what it is to neighbor. And so what it looks like for us, when we have to ask the question, what does it mean to be a neighbor? What does it mean to be a good neighbor? When we ask that question as Christians, the most simple place to go is to the story that we just read. And a lot of you have probably heard it before, the story of the Good Samaritan. Weirdly enough, like it's so built into our culture that we have a thing called Good Samaritan laws. Have you heard about those? That if you were to stop on the side of the road, someone has been in a car accident, you pull them out of their car because the car is on fire, and you end up injuring them, they can't sue you because you were doing your best to help, right? Like those are Good Samaritan laws, but that's just straight up from the Bible parable that Jesus told. So this is built into our culture. But Jesus tells this parable, and for those of you who may not be super familiar with it, a parable is a story that's not necessarily factual, but it has a bigger point that's being made, right? So Jesus tells this story. So I want to start in Luke chapter 10, verse 25. We're just going to stay there the whole time, so you can just open up to that. Luke chapter 10, verse 25. And I'm just going to go by verse for a few seconds and talk about this. Luke chapter 10, verse 25. It says this. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, it's interesting because the word lawyer, I don't know what it says in some of your other Bibles, but the word lawyer is a little bit misleading. When we think of lawyer, we think of this guy who's going to defend us in court, right? That's not what this guy was. This guy was someone who understood what's called Mosaic law. And explain that. Back in the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, those books are all written by a guy named Moses. Moses was the leader of Israel at that period of time, and God revealed to him a bunch of stuff, and he also told Moses a bunch of stuff about how to set up this community so that they were living in love, and they weren't killing each other, right? And so there's all of these list of things. Just imagine someone trying to set up laws as Moses goes on, and he's the leader. He's going to set up laws for some weird stuff, right? Like if there's mildew in a tent, you got to burn, or you got to leave it there for 7 days, and if it's still there, you got to burn it, right? Like just things like that, because you don't know about germs, so or mold or whatever it is. And so there's a bunch of different stuff. This guy, this lawyer that stands up, the reason he's referred to as a lawyer is because he was an expert in all of that. He's a guy who knows it inside and out. He knows everything in it because it's all of these ways of how the Jewish people were supposed to live. And at this period of time that Jesus is here on earth, the Jewish people had become incredibly focused on keeping all of this stuff because they figured, well, about 400 years ago, we got utterly destroyed by a couple of bigger empires. And you know why? It's because we rejected God. That's why. So, by logical next step, if we keep all of the laws of God really well, then he'll bless us and et cetera, et cetera. So this guy is one of those people, he just knows it back and forth. And so it's interesting because what he seems to be doing is testing Jesus' theology. He's saying, like, are you a heretic? Who are you? Like, what do you believe about all of this stuff? And so he says, what would I have to do to inherit eternal life? And so he asked that question. Then Jesus has wisdom. I love Jesus. Jesus has so much wisdom. And so he doesn't just give this 10-step process of, oh, this is how you get eternal life. He doesn't do that. Instead, he turns it around. Well, he says to him in verse 26, what is written in the law? How do you read it? Because he's asking this guy, well, you're the expert. You're the one who knows it all. What do you think it says? And so the guy ends up replying, and he says, verses 27, 28, and he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus says to him, you have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. Now, I love this because according to the law expert, you could take everything in all of the law and you could boil it down to two things. Love God with everything you are, with everything you have, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those two things, okay? That's going to become important as we look at this. Love God and love your neighbor. And then Jesus replies to him, yeah, exactly. Like, do all that and you're good. Like, you'll live. But then the guy has one more question, right? Do you notice this? He has one more question. And this is how it says, verse 29, but he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And I think this question is what gets me the most about this. Because he says, well, who is my neighbor? And what he's inherently asking Jesus to do is he's asking him to put people in categories. Who is my neighbor? Because if they're my neighbor, the command of God is that I have to love them. But if they're not my neighbor, then I don't have to worry about it. And so he's asking Jesus, who then do I have to love? That's inherently what he's asking. But then again, Jesus still has so much wisdom. And so he doesn't just go about telling him, well, these people, yes, unless they do this, and then this person all the time, and then, he doesn't do that. He just tells a story. And we probably know this story to a certain degree. There's this guy. He's going down from Jerusalem, which is the capital of Israel at that point, to a city named Jericho. And as he's walking down the path, all of these robbers jump on him, beat him up, take all of his stuff, and leave him there for dead. And if you just imagine this guy is just laying there, probably can't move, probably completely out of it, maybe knocked out, whatever it is, he's just laying there. But there's hope, because all of a sudden you hear these footsteps, and around the corner comes a priest. And a priest was the guy who they would go to the temple, and they would offer sacrifices. They were, in essence, like the pastors of that day. And so it's this pastor, this guy who, coming around the corner, he should be helping, right? So there's hope. But all of a sudden you realize, and actually let me say one more thing, I think Jesus chose the cities that he mentioned on purpose. He chose Jerusalem to Jericho. There's a road between the two. Jerusalem is where the temple is. Jericho is where a bunch of priests and later Levites that we're going to see in the story, a bunch of priests and Levites lived. So the way that this worked is they didn't have full-time jobs like maybe someone like I did. They would work, do their fields, whatever it was, back at home, and then they would spend, in essence, like 2-week shifts at the temple, and then they go back home, and then they come back whenever their shift was up next. So there's a bunch of priests and Levites like traveling this road, either going to the temple or coming from the temple. What do you do at the temple? You do all of the love God stuff. Love God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. Where they're going to go do that. They're going to actually facilitate it for other people. That's what this guy is doing. So we can pretty much infer that this guy is either coming from the temple, where he has just served God with all of his heart, soul, and his mind, or he's going to the temple to go do that. But then there's something else that's about to come into question, and it's the second part of the love God, love neighbor. What's he going to do about neighbor? And so we see it. He's walking, and the footsteps are coming. If the guy on the ground can hear him, then he's like, oh, someone's finally here. But you just kind of see the word picture that Jesus uses. He says that as soon as he saw him, he just kind of went to the other side and then just kept walking. Like not like I'm going to step over here and then keep walking. Just kind of slowly veered around, kept walking. And what I think is interesting is you could say that there's a few reasons he might have not helped. Maybe he was afraid of getting jumped too. Maybe the robbers were still around. Maybe it was a trap. Maybe it was because as a priest, if he touched a dead body, he was ritually unclean for a period of time, and that would mess with his ability to serve, or he would have to go through all this process. Maybe he just didn't think he could help, right? Like, this guy's way too hurt for me to help, so there's no reason for me to do it. But what's interesting is that Jesus doesn't give him a motive for not helping. It just says he didn't help. Because what if all of the excuses for not helping didn't change the fact that he didn't do it? What if all of our excuses don't change the fact that we don't? So he doesn't give him a reason. But then there's still some more hope, because another guy walks by, and he's a Levite. And a Levite was a little bit different than the priest. He would serve at the temple, but he would serve as like a temple guard, or he would help wash different things. He'd kind of do all the auxiliary things surrounding the actual worship stuff. And so he's heading to the temple, or he's coming from the temple. We don't know which one. But either way, he's going to do his love God stuff. And the exact same thing. And when he sees the body, or when he sees the man lying, he veers around him. The guy's just left there. More unexplained motives, but then his actions are still clear. But then there are more footsteps, and this time it's a Samaritan. And this phrase, but a Samaritan, because that's how Jesus says, but a Samaritan as he was journeying, that phrase doesn't have the impact on us that it would on someone in that period of time. And I'm going to explain to you what a Samaritan was so you can kind of understand why this was such a big deal for Jesus to say. But a few hundred years before Jesus, there was two different kingdoms that they had split. It was all of the people of God, the people of Israel. They had split into two separate kingdoms, the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of Israel. The kingdom of Israel was in the north. Well, the kingdom of Israel, both of them end up believing God and getting destroyed by kingdoms, but the kingdom of Israel left God earlier, over a longer period of time, became far more evil. And over time, as they just did, like, God, we don't want you, we don't want your protection, this big empire called Assyria came and just utterly wiped them out. And when the Assyrians came in, what they did is they took all of the wealthy landowners, the middle-class people, all of the Jewish people there, except for kind of the poor, and they took them out of the land and just resettled them somewhere else, closer to Assyria. But then what the Assyrians did is they had all those poorer Jewish people living there. They took people from probably Arabia and then brought them to the land of Israel. What the Samaritans were the descendants of these people who had mixed together. The problem is that back in the Mosaic law, remember the guy who was an expert in Mosaic law, back in that law, it was told to the Israelites, don't intermarry. And here's the reason why. God says, I am blessing you so that you will bless the world. I am blessing you so that you will change the entire world. If you start intermarrying with other people with different customs, different gods, all of these different things, it's going to mess with you and you're going to become just like them and you won't change the world. That's what he says, right? Makes enough sense. But what happened is, so these poor Jewish people who were there, who now had all this land and all that stuff, now there's a bunch of foreigners there, well, they inevitably intermarry. They form their own kind of sect of Judaism called Samaritanism, and they have their own set of beliefs and all that stuff. Now, fast forward a few hundred years to the time of Jesus, and you have all of these Jewish people who have come back to the land after they were exiled. They've all come back, and now they're like, well, the reason that we all got exiled is because we didn't believe God. We didn't follow God. We weren't pure enough to God, right? We didn't follow all of his laws. So let's follow all of his laws. Well, guess what one of those is? Don't intermarry. And so what you have is these people who not only have their own religion, but now are intermarried Jews, and they're the descendants of them. For context, put yourself back in the 60s, and you have the son of a black man and a white woman, this mixed race guy, and how he's viewed by the world. That's what you have happening here. So when Jesus says, a Samaritan, put yourself back in the 60s, Jesus sitting in a church, and he's like, but a half-white, half-black man. And all of a sudden you kind of start to get the feeling, right? This is kind of shocking to the Jews because they hate them. They're half-breeds. They're all of this different thing. And a Samaritan comes. And Jesus says, and he saw him and stops to help. And again, for context, in the 60s, it's that son of a black man and a white woman stopping to help a white man. And I don't want to be careful here, but I want to bring this into reality without taking political sides. But it's an illegal Hispanic immigrant stopping to help a guy with a MAGA hat on. It's a member of the LGBTQ plus community stopping to help this staunch evangelical person with a God hates fags thing on their bumper sticker. It's a Muslim stopping to help a white supremacist. And then Jesus asked a question in Luke chapter 10:36. And this one's a rough one if you're a Jewish person. He says, which of those three do you think proved to be the neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? Which one of them? And if you're a Jewish person, you're sitting there like, I don't want to say it. And if you notice, I didn't include this in the slides, but if you notice the next verse, it says, the guy says, well, the one who showed him mercy. The guy can't even bring himself to say, well, the Samaritan. He's the one who showed him mercy because philosophically he knows, but he can't bring himself to do it. Crazy, yeah? But what I love about this is the first point, if you want to write this down, is loving your neighbor goes beyond categories. And it always will. Loving your neighbor goes beyond categories. To Jesus, neighboring goes beyond proximity. It goes beyond categories. It isn't about, I'm a Christian and they're a non-Christian. It's not about, I'm white and I don't want to say anything wrong about around minorities. It's not about Christian or Muslim. It's not about legal or illegal. It's not about Republican or Democrat. It's not about kind or unkind. It's not about they're friendly or they're not friendly. It's not about someone who drinks or someone who doesn't. It's not about young or old. It's not about gay or straight. It's not about friend or enemy. It's not about agree or disagree. There is only one category to Jesus, and it is neighbor. There is only one category to Jesus, and it is neighbor. He even says later, he says, you have heard it said, love your neighbors, hate your enemies. I say to you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. What he's saying is, love your enemies means make them a neighbor. There's only one category to Jesus. This man wanted Jesus. What he wanted to do is, well, do I have to love the guy who loves Trump? Do I have to love the guy who voted for Hillary? And Jesus is like, that's not the point. Do I have to love this person who just utterly disagrees with me, or do I have to love this person who totally agrees with me but like has this really weird thing that I don't want? Jesus is like, that's not the point. Love your neighbor. There are no categories. Loving your neighbor goes beyond categories. And if we want to grow in our relationships, we have to recognize this. And I want to be careful because it doesn't downplay our differences. Okay, it doesn't downplay our differences. We're not all faceless mannequins who are just like all the same all of a sudden because we can't have categories. It's not that. For instance, I'm half Sri Lankan, half white. I'm a middle-class pastor married to a white woman with 2 dogs. I love watching soccer. I love playing video games, talking about history, going on walks through Japanese gardens, and my favorite activity is to go on hikes alone. That's me. You're your own conglomeration of things. So we're not the same, and that's okay. Being a neighbor, loving my neighbor, does not mean that I have to just make everything, that I just have to ignore the differences. But what it does mean is that we embrace each other in spite of them. Even if those differences would drive others apart, they don't drive us apart. Even if it means that you're a jerk, well, I'm still going to be your neighbor. If I'm a jerk, then you're still going to treat me as a neighbor. It doesn't mean we let injustice go unaddressed, but it does mean that we seek for reconciliation and we forgive. What our broken tendency to do is exactly what that guy did, the lawyer, where he's like, well, who is my neighbor? Tell me who I have to love. That's our broken tendency. And yet, loving my neighbor means I don't get to categorize. I don't get to do that. But there's more to this. Luke chapter 10, verses 33 through 34 says, but a Samaritan, as he journeyed, this is the part, the Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where this man who was beaten was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. And he went to him, and he bound up his wounds, and he was pouring oil and wine on them. Then he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And I know it almost sounds silly when we consider that this guy was physically injured. But here's the thing I want to tell you. That the Samaritan man, when he goes up to this guy who's beaten and bruised, he would have had to have seen and understood where this man was hurt so that he could effectively help him. Right? He would have seen and understood. Makes sense when, well, he's bleeding right here. Obviously, he's hurt here. Makes sense when someone's physically injured. But it brings up this other point. That's my second point. That loving your neighbor means knowing your neighbor. Loving your neighbor means knowing your neighbor. And as dumb as it sounds, I think a lot of the time we end up bandaging things on other people that don't need to be bandaged, right? Someone's like, yeah, like I'm just not feeling well today, and then we launch into like this 15-minute thing about all of the remedies they need to try, right? They'll say something like, I don't know if I love my job. And we're like, oh, well, you should do this, or you should try this, or I'm so sorry. Maybe we can find you another job. We try and fix people's problems. That's not even really the bandage that needs to be placed. There's other stuff. And there's this fundamental truth is that if I don't know someone, that my help is a lot of the time worthless and at worst harmful. If I don't really know someone, that my help is a lot of the time worthless and at worst harmful to them. And it becomes a huge problem across generations, where when an older person doesn't take the time to get to know someone younger and still gives advice and still tells them what to do and still acts like they know them, then there's this resentment that's built up. You don't actually know me. You haven't taken the time. You're just giving me advice, or you're telling me things to do that don't pertain to me at all. You don't even know what I like or what I'm interested in. But then there's a flip side to this too for younger generations, young adults. When we don't get to know people who are older than us, then we often just put them in categories and boxes, believing that they're always that way, they're always going to be that way. They're just that person who is that specific political leaning. They're just that person who will always speak to me in that way. And we don't get to know people's stories, and then all of a sudden we have no ability to actually be closer, let alone, here's the crazy part, actually be a person who can bandage wounds, even in someone who's older than us. When we don't get to know somebody, our help is potentially worthless, if not harmful. The greatest impact that I've had on people is on people that I've spent a lot of time with. And this isn't me, like, look at what I've done, because I found this out on accident. Because here's what I would love to do. I would love to just say, your theology is wrong. The way you're thinking about God is wrong. Why don't I fix that? Right? Why don't I fix the way you're thinking? Then your life will be better. That's what I want to do. That's my personality. And so I love to just fix that in a couple of times meeting with people. That's my tendency. But what's crazy is that I have found that the people that I have spent lots of time with, all of a sudden one day I'll just say something, speaking to them because I know them. I won't think very much of it. And all of a sudden they'll say later, that was actually really impactful. It wasn't me, it was because of our relationship. The biggest impact that I've had on people, and you know this, you know that this is true, that the people who've had the biggest impact on your life are people who knew you, not people who didn't know you. That someone can come out of the blue and just be like, hey, like, listen, I want to give you the best opportunity ever. And it's like, well, that's cool. But that person who is consistently part of your life for decades is the person that you can still go back and talk to, who will still actually like make an impact on your life. That's the reality, is that time is what measures impact. And the reality is that we can't really be good neighbors if we don't know our neighbors. Loving my neighbor requires that I know them. But this goes hand in hand with my last point. And look at this. Luke. We're going to go back to Luke 10:33 and 34. And I'm going to read this again. I'm going to focus on something else. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where this beaten man was. And when he saw him, he had compassion. I want you to stop there for a second. He had compassion. He had compassion, which is a step better. It's a step better than the other guys, right? You recognize that? Like the other guys, Jesus doesn't even tell us what their motivation was. He just says they walked to the other side and kept going. This guy had compassion, which is awesome. It's amazing. But then verse 34, just the very beginning of it. And so he went to him. He went to him. And I think a lot of us have a lot of compassion. We have compassion. We see people, where they're at, why they're there. Man, I would love for their life to be different. I would love for everything to change for them. But this story about Jesus, that Jesus is telling about neighboring, tells us this. It's my third point. Loving your neighbor means being the difference. Loving your neighbor means being the difference. And there's one more thing right after that. It says, loving my neighbor. And I want you to write this down. Loving my neighbor means not simply having compassion. It means taking action. Loving my neighbor means not simply having compassion. It means taking action. Taking the time to get to know my neighbor, to be a presence in their life. Taking the time to not just send my thoughts and prayers, but to actually go out of the way and be present in their life, to actually ask questions, to invite them into my home, to send a text, to be consistent. And I get it. Like, I understand that we can't be that for everybody. In fact, Jesus doesn't ask you to be that for everybody. That's why we're all here, okay? Because you're not called to be everybody's savior, but what you can do is start investing in other people, being the difference in just a few lives, and watching as then God takes them after you have spent time, or maybe it's a couple of years, maybe it's a decade of spending time with them and then watching the impact they can make on the world. Jesus shows this first and foremost. He didn't invest. Jesus came to this world and what did he do? He chilled with 12 guys for 3 years. That's inefficient. He could have come now, we talked about this, he could have come now, posted one video to Instagram and been world famous. But he comes and just chills with 12 guys for 3.5 years. Why? Because look at the impact that those guys made on other people, and then those people made on other people, and it just grew like crazy. So I want to tell you this, as I say this, because I know a lot of the time we're like, oh my gosh, this sounds like so exhausting, right? Okay, I gotta love everybody. I want to do that, but I got stuff to do. Jesus isn't asking you to do it for everybody, but he's asking you to do it for somebody. For a couple people, for 3 people. He's asking you to do it for some people. And I get that we can't do it for everyone, but far too often we see someone that we can invest our time in, and then we tell ourselves, well, we don't really have anything of value to add to their life. Your story, the fact that God has been working in your story is value enough. And I want to tell you something right now, that God has given you all the tools that you need. Maybe they're hidden deep inside of you. You don't even see them yet. But God has given you all the tools that you need to make an impact on the people that he has already planned out for you to have an impact on. See, a lot of us are like, well, I don't know what to say or what to do. We're going to talk about some practical things here in a second, but I'm just telling you right now that God has already given you everything that you need. Now it's a process of stepping out. And as he reveals those things in your life, it builds your faith. We tell ourselves we're too busy. We tell ourselves they wouldn't really want us in their lives. Those things are all lies. You're not too busy. This is a huge burden on my life right now. You're not too busy. You're not. It's better to do a very few things and have a big impact than it is to do a lot of things and have very little impact. And sometimes the one little thing that you need to do is start investing in other people. Here's what I truly believe. If we're going to grow in our relationships, if we're going to learn what the Bible says and do it, then loving our neighbor can mean these 3 things. Loving your neighbor goes beyond categories. So it's not about old or young. It's not about Republican or Democrat. It's not about like-minded or not. Loving your neighbor means loving them beyond categories. Okay? Loving your neighbor means knowing your neighbor. It means putting in specific effort beyond the effort you would normally do to get to know somebody deeply, instead of just hoping that your random 10-second impact will change their life. Loving your neighbor means being the difference. It means realizing that God has put you on earth not to live in a spirit of fear, but to live in a spirit of boldness, to live in faith. And just like there's a pastor who said this to me one day, he didn't say it to me directly. He said this in a talk he was doing. He said this: God doesn't want to hear your excuses. He wants to see your faith. And in that period of time, I was so done. I was ready to leave pastoring. I'm not joking. I was ready. And he says he doesn't want to hear your excuses. He wants to see your faith. I was like, oh, I've been making a lot of excuses for why these things aren't working, why this isn't happening, why this, all this stuff. So when I started having faith, it's kind of crazy what God starts to do. God doesn't want to hear your excuses. He wants to see your faith. You can have so much compassion for someone else, but if your excuses leave them beaten and bruised on the side of the road, then your compassion doesn't really mean a lot. So loving our neighbors means being willing to put in the effort it will take to be the difference. So let's get really practical. 3 things right at the end here that you can do to start, okay? And it's so simple. So simple. If it means not categorizing, knowing your neighbor, and being the difference in their life, here's 3 things. You can write them down there at the bottom of your note sheet. It's this: get some food. Not just for you. I don't mean get some food so you can psych yourself up to do this. That's not what I mean. Get some food, right? There's even a beginning step that I just totally left out because it's kind of a given. But you need to start praying about, God, who can I have an impact on? Who in my life do I need to start investing in? And then once God is impressing this on you, just get some food. Hey, do you want to go grab coffee? You want to go to lunch? Hey, come over to my house. We'll have a meal. Invite a couple over to your house if you're a couple, whatever it is. Get some food. There's no better place than over food to actually bond and grow. That's what Jesus did all the time. He was eating with his disciples all the time. That's what bonded them. Second one, ask questions. And I don't mean you can never share anything about yourself, that you can only ever ask questions, because nobody likes being interrogated, but ask questions, okay? I mean, start the process of learning how to ask good questions. If you're meeting somebody, there's a space below in your note sheet that you can write some stuff down. If you're getting to know somebody, I have the best question you could ever ask. What's your story? What's your story? What was it like growing up? What was high school like for you? What was college like for you? What's your job like? What's your story, right? What's your story? You can ask them, what are your hobbies? You can ask somebody, do you have weird habits that I would be repulsed by? I'm just kidding. Don't ask that question. You don't want to know that. You can just start to ask questions, though. I mean this. Ask questions, because the more you get to know somebody, the more that you learn, the more you can relate, the better your relationship is going to be. Last one, be consistent. A lot of us have these moments where we go out to coffee with somebody, we get a meal with somebody, and we're blown away. Wow, they're really cool. I didn't realize that before. And then we let busyness get in the way of ever doing it again. The thing is that one time is great, but it will not make a difference. Consistency over the course of 2 years will see you and your relationship grow to the point where you have influence in each other's lives. 3 things. Get food, ask questions, be consistent. That's all. That's literally it. And just start praying, God, who in my life? Is there 1 or 2 people in my life that I could start investing in today? And some of you are like, well, but I'm not even that close to God yet. I don't know what I'm doing. You want to start getting close to God, start doing what he does. You're going to be forced to rely on him in ways that you never thought you're going to have to rely on him before. Loving our neighbor. It's what we're called to do. It's what we're going to do in this church. It's what our focus is moving forward, growing in our relationships. So I'm challenging you today. Start it. I'm going to share a story as I close. I didn't plan to share this, but I'm going to say this. I talked to somebody about this last week. I told them, hey, listen, one of our leaders, I was like, listen, 3 people, who can you invest in? So she told me a couple of names, and then she was still praying about a 3rd one. I'm going to tell you this. One of them was a coworker. Okay, a coworker that she had who had quit. And this coworker who had quit called her up after and was like, hey, I hope you're not disappointed in me. She didn't quit to her, but just she had quit her job. I hope you're not disappointed. I need you in my life, all this stuff. And so I told her, yeah, invest, do it. So that she goes out to lunch with this girl. I find this out a week later. I talked to her on a Thursday. She'd gone out to dinner or out to lunch with this girl on a Friday. I find out this next Thursday. She's like, we talked for 4 hours. We ended up doing like a mini Bible study. She's like, I never thought this could happen. My point is that when you start, God is already working in somebody else's life. When you get to be part of what he's doing in someone else's life, it's mind-blowing. So I'm challenging you today. Just start praying. 1 or 2 people. Get some food. Ask some questions. Be consistent. And come back in a year and tell me how it went. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for how you have invested in us. God, we were neighbors. We lived in this garden, and you were with us, and you were always there walking in the cool of the day. But then we decided that we would like to live elsewhere. We'd like to do our own things. We'd like to live according to our own rules. And so we get a little separated. But Lord, you are so merciful and so compassionate and so loving that even when we separated ourselves from you, that you didn't let us get too far away, that you still call us neighbors. You have desired, you actually, after we separate ourselves from you, you came on your own volition to us to be our neighbor and to show us how to love our neighbors. I just thank you that you're that type of God, that we don't have to be afraid of. God, you're not asking us to do this out of any sort of pressure, out of like, you better do this or else. You're asking us to do this because you love us and you love the people that we're going to invest in. I thank you for that, Lord. Thank you so much for everything you've done, and thank you for what we're going to see you do. In your name, amen.